We're going to preview Ohio State versus Oregon. This is going to be the game of the year, I think, in the Big Ten. And it's been hyped up for months now. It's almost one of those like, what more can I even say about it? It's like talking about your favorite film or something after a few years, or like your favorite, I don't know. I really like each of these teams, and I'm really excited for this one. And it's interesting too because we just went over kind of the transient property thing, and this team beat this team, which beat this team. In this case, these teams have a common opponent, and a common opponent that played each team right back to back. So we get this kind of, in like the research world, we call it like treatment. They each got a similar treatment. So we got to see what Ohio State looked like with the treatment that was playing Michigan State, and we got to see how that same treatment affected Oregon. And it's really interesting because each team beat MSU kind of in the same fashion. MSU was able to move the ball a little bit here or there, but they turned the ball over like they typically do. MSU had some wins on defense, but not enough to keep the game close. And ultimately, both Oregon and Ohio State, when each of these teams played MSU, their talent and their skill position play and their trench play, even, especially for Ohio State, by the way. Ohio State has a really good offensive line. Like I think they've pretty much fixed that offensive line. But also, we don't know, speaking of Indiana, who we just talked about a minute ago, we don't entirely know that much about Ohio State because Michigan State's probably Michigan State and Iowa. Now that I think about it, they did play Iowa this past week, and they ended up putting 34 points, or excuse me, 35 points on the number 1 rated SP Plus defense in Iowa. So that's their one big test so far this season. But we still don't really know too much about either of these teams. And now Oregon hasn't necessarily played entirely up to their potential. But I always say, and I keep coming back to this, especially with Oregon this season, be wary of a team that isn't playing up to their potential, but is still winning games. And for Oregon's case, not just winning games, but completely blowing teams out. I would say, especially with the Dylan Gabriel interception that he threw in the end zone earlier on in that game, especially with some of the incompletions, and some of the, a couple of stuffed runs here or there where Jordan James was trying to get going. In spite of all that, Oregon beat Michigan State 31-13. Or 31-10. What was it? I'd have to look it up. My score prediction for that game over at Darren Talks Ball was 31-13, I think, and I just misquoted. Yeah, 31-10. I had predicted to go 31-13, so I guess pats on backs for getting that one close. But Ohio State isn't a team that's not quite playing up to their potential so far. Ohio State is a team that is absolutely blowing the doors off people, and it's almost like, how much better can this team even play? At this point in the season, they're ninth in SP Plus offense. That's my handwriting coming through. Second overall in SP Plus defense. Actually, the SP Plus rankings just got updated. Now that I think about it, my notes were out of date. The SP Plus rankings were updated today. I almost forgot. I forgot to update my notes. They're now the number 1 SP Plus rated defense. That's the Cade McNamara effect. That's what you get having played Cade McNamara in your recent. Again, speaking of Iowa, they struggled for a half, and Iowa was able to keep that close. I think it was like 7-0 at half. But again, halftime adjustments, great coaching, elite coaching, and Ohio State was able to pull away in the second half of that game. My big thing on Ohio State so far this season, by the way, and I don't know if enough people are talking about it, this is not the same Ohio State team that we've seen in previous seasons. It's just not. And the hiring of Chip Kelly, I like the hiring of Chip Kelly in the offseason, even as a Michigan fan, for Ohio State, because I thought it was a philosophical schematic shift that they needed to make. And I think I was right. This is not a finesse team anymore. This isn't a team that's just merely looking to kind of get you in the wrong position defensively and hope to hit some open spaces. This is a team that is totally willing to block you, and all 11 players, from what I see watching the film, are totally invested into this ground game being great. By the way, in previous seasons to this point in the season, most Ohio State teams in the last 3 years were somewhere in like the 30s or 40s of rushing offense. They were just good enough. Travion Henderson was hitting just enough big run plays to kind of be up there in like the 5 to 6 yards per carry average. And given what they had offensively in other areas with, CJ Stroud and Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison Jr., that was enough. This season, they're 14th in rushing offense so far this season with the two-headed monster that we all know the names of, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, and they're averaging over 6.24 yards per carry. That's a stat that came even after, again, playing Iowa, who had the number one rated SP Plus defense headed into their game this past season. Ohio State, their run game cannot be complimented enough how much they've improved it. In previous seasons, it was simple because Ryan Day isn't a run game guy. Ryan Day is a pro style, air it out, throw it around the yard kind of guy. That's the kind of offense he calls. He's not as familiar with all the different aspects of running the football that Chip Kelly is. Chip Kelly gets a lot of credit for being kind of a spread offense guy, and a lot of people think that he's more of a finesse coach, and maybe he is in some regards because spread offenses, even when they are running the ball, do like to kind of attack spaces as opposed to winning blocks. But Chip Kelly has really kind of always been, in a way, still an old school coach who wants to run the ball and block people. He just kind of found a way to mesh together a lot of honestly old option concepts and wing T concepts with spread stuff out of spread formations. And you see that when Ohio State plays now. It's not just stretch, counter, stretch, maybe a halfback zone. It's a diverse, multifaceted rushing attack that can get you at any angle, at any speed, and get those linemen. By the way, the offensive line is playing great so far this season, out in space, blocking people out in space for their running backs, and it is physical. And one other thing on Ohio State so far this season that's really impressed me is in previous years, I've talked about it, I mentioned it on the Michigan Voice of College Football show a couple of weeks ago. I'm a guest over there once per month. I'm really thankful for TJ having me in the rotation over there too. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, all their stuff, by the way. In previous years, when Ohio State called like a wide receiver screen, a basic wide receiver screen, which Ryan Day used to like to call all the time, and this team still does, by the way, they just scheme it better, I think. There's different versions of it that look different and can confuse defenses. But in previous years, when they do it, I'd think to myself, oh, thank you for the free down, is what I would say, because ultimately the receivers weren't too invested in blocking and it get blown up. It would 9 times out of 10, especially against Michigan. A lot of those wide receiver screens would get blown up. And I know there's a reason for calling them, even though they get blown up, that we don't need to get into the weeds on here. But this year's not the case. I see guys like Jeremiah Smith coming in and he immediately being a pretty good blocker. I see Emeka Egbuka blocking better than he has in the previous few years. Guys like Brandon Inniss and the younger guys also getting involved. Don't overlook or talk down a team where all 11 players on the offense are invested in running the football. That's what Ohio State is so far this season. And their passing attack is still good. It's still good, even with Will Howard. Will Howard, by the way, one of the more efficient quarterbacks in all of college football. I think he's right up there in the top 15 of passing efficiency. So Will Howard's operating that offense well from a passing standpoint, and they're running the ball amazingly well. Again, over 6 yards per carry so far this season between their two running backs. Defensively, they're the best defense in college football. That's borne out in Bill Connolly's SP Plus, which is a metric that I very much respect, and I think most of you would as well. They're fourth in passing yards allowed at 8.65 yards per completion. They're third overall in rushing defense. So they're a team, when we think in like the classical way of thinking in terms of Big Ten football, how you win in the Big Ten. What is it? Running the football, stopping the run, converting on third downs, and converting in the red zone, right? Well, they run the ball very effectively. By the way, their offense is very good on third down. And their rushing defense is third in the entire country, giving up 2.25 yards per rush, and that's after they played Caleb Johnson in Iowa. And granted, they haven't played a schedule like Michigan. Granted, they haven't played a lot of other testy teams like Iowa, but that's also what makes this game intriguing, because I still don't entirely know if they're really this good, and I think we will know for sure that the answer to that question after playing Oregon. By the way, Ohio State's defense is third in red zone defense in the entire country, too. So this is going to be a matchup of absolute juggernauts. I think everyone would know that by now. It's probably why you're here watching. But Oregon kind of thinking in the rock, paper, scissors way of looking at these matchups is what I like to do a lot of. Oregon kind of seems to have, and they're getting it pieced together just in time. They really are. They're finally clicking, I think, enough to be effective against this Ohio State defense, because earlier in the season, of course, they had some issues with the offensive line. They've kind of since fixed that. They got the kid moved over to center, which seemed to be a great fix for them. They, of course, struggled in a game with Idaho. They struggled against Boise State, but everyone's going to struggle with Boise State, honestly. I think, honestly, if Boise State plays Michigan tomorrow, Boise State probably wins, but y'all ain't ready for that conversation yet, especially you Michigan fans out there. But Oregon has what may be a great test for Ohio State in rock, paper, scissors matchups, because Oregon's efficient, and against great defenses, the best way to go about it sometimes, because you're not going to hit all your deep shots against Ohio State. You're just not. Against Caleb Downs and Davison Igbinosun and Denzel Burke. I want to say Trey Burke, like the Michigan basketball player from like 10 years ago. That's not true. Denzel Burke and those guys, you're not going to hit a ton of deep shots against this defense. But what you can do, and what we even saw Michigan State do a little bit of, again, Michigan State, their first 5 drives against Ohio State, Michigan State drove the football down the field. They were able to hit some passing plays over the middle. They were able to hit some plays that were like 10 to 15 to 20 yards downfield with Aiden Childs and Nick Marsh and those guys. Michigan State just couldn't capitalize in the red zone. Well, Oregon can. And by the way, they've got a pretty good rushing offense paired with it with Jordan James, which is much better of a rushing offense than Michigan State. Dillon Gabriel, by the way, 14th in passing efficiency so far this season with a 168.88 rating, and he's got 10.98 yards per completion. This is the number 4 SP plus rated offense going against the number 1 SP plus rated defense. And again, a big reason why Oregon is rated that highly is because they can efficiently move the ball down the field. They can get 6 to 7 yards per play against an Ohio State defense. It's just going to be a matter for me of, can they capitalize once they get to the red zone? Can they avoid the mistakes that Dillon Gabriel has made? Can they keep from throwing some interceptions and things like that? That's what they've got to do. They're 22nd, by the way, in the country in SP plus ranked defense. Little questionable there. And they're 24th, still within the top 25 of rushing defense. So key players for Oregon, because I do think that's obviously the worst unit out of all 4 units between these two teams. The major unit, special teams, is a whole different thing, which we don't really have time to get into here, because I want to get into Penn State USC before we get out of here. We're already about an hour and a half in, but 24th in rushing defense. They give up, though they're 24th, they give up just 3.65 yards per rush against. So guys that really need to stick out for Oregon in this game, because you got to find a way to get Ohio State off their heels offensively. And you got to find a way to get them to be a little bit one-dimensional, though I think that's going to be really, really hard, because even if Ohio State has a bad rushing day for Quinshon Judkins and TreVeyon Henderson, frankly and honestly, with that scheme of Chip Kelly's getting them into good plays to run the football, and with that offensive line playing as well is just going to be like 4 yards per carry, which is still decent. 4 to 4.5 yards per carry is probably about all you can ask for. Keep them from hitting the home runs, especially TreVeyon. He's kind of an expert at that. He's probably the lesser of the 2 backs so far this season. Quinshon can also hit some home runs, but that's really what TreVeyon does. So you need Bryce Betcher, by the way, the baseball player, the inside linebacker who's kind of taken over this season. You need him to have a big game. You need Jordan Burch and Mateo Uiagalelei to have big games, because they've got to really set some hard edges and keep those running backs contained in the running game. Again, Ohio State still runs a lot of stretch. They still run a lot of things off tackle, and you get those running backs into space. Those guys have to be effective. Those 3 players for Oregon really have to have huge games. But I think this is going to be a close one. This one could come down to a field goal. This one could be really close. I have a preview and prediction all ready to go over at Darren Talks Ball. If you want to go subscribe to me on my other channel, I'll give you guys a score prediction over there. That's me teasing things a little bit. But just to tease a little bit more, I do give the edge to Oregon at home. By the way, with the skill position talent that they have, Ohio State, again, hasn't faced a receiving core like Oregon so far this season with Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, and Trayshawn Holden. So it's gonna be a great game. It's gonna be a great game, great atmosphere out there at Austin Stadium. And honestly, how awesome is it that we've added these 4 West Coast teams to the Big Ten? I know there are a lot of gripes about it, that college football isn't regional anymore, that it's not the thing it used to be. Going back to what we were talking about Michigan at the beginning of this video, things change. You can't hold on to things forever. And sometimes things change for the good. Oregon being in this conference is a damn good thing, in my opinion. I know that shakes my camera every time I do it. I'm just doing it for the Bulls. I don't know. But anyway, that's Ohio State versus Oregon. Either team could really easily win this one. Ohio State, I think, is playing like the best team in the country right now. But again, don't overlook a team that isn't quite playing up to their potential yet, but is still blown out a ton of teams so far this season, which is what Oregon has done. We're going to get into Penn State at USC in just a minute here. But first, I want to get some of you guys' comments. Oregon Ducks says, "Go Ducks!" Like the car in the picture there. I got an old either Challenger or Roadrunner. I assume that's a Charger. Excuse me, Charger or Roadrunner in that one. Like it. Jim, our Cal Miami conference game was the topper. That's wild. West Coast teams in the ACC. Geography doesn't matter anymore as long as you have money or you want money, which is what Cal and all those teams moving to the ACC wanted. The Pac-12 is going to be crazy now, too. They've added a bunch of teams from all over the country. Oh, going to get into Penn State versus USC in a minute here. I don't really have any notes on that game, by the way. I just wanted to kind of riff on it to kind of close this one out because I really like Penn State. But I'm going to give you guys a minute to catch up. And I am going to read some comments if you guys have more comments. Get those super chats in and stuff like that. Jim R. sounds like OSU has the better line play. Yes, but I will say one thing, and one thing that I didn't really get into in that preview. Jordan Birch and Mateo Uiagalelei are probably better, honestly, so far this season, better pass rushing defensive ends than Jack Sawyer and JTT. The one complaint that I've seen from Ohio State people so far this season is that the pass rush still hasn't quite been there. I think Jack Sawyer leads the team in sacks with like 2. And considering the teams that they played, I mean, Akron, you couldn't get like 4 or 5 sacks on Akron. You couldn't sack Marshall for more than what you did. Yeah, I think Jordan Birch is a really, really good defensive end, by the way, that people aren't talking about enough. That guy is big, fast, long, all the things we typically say of really good defensive ends. He's got all the physical traits and the motor too. So interior 2, Oregon, I'm blanking on names, but they got the Michigan State transfer there. Derek Harmon, I think is his name. Played pretty well so far this season. He got some revenge on MSU with a sack or a tackle for loss or something like that. So yes, Ohio State definitely has the better offensive line. I think Ohio State, frankly, I'm trying to think. We're about to get into Penn State, USC. I actually really like Penn State's offensive line. I think they've played incredibly well, especially in recent games. They've been able to run the football. Jim says, good point. Yeah, I just think, at this point in their careers, Jack Sawyer and JTT kind of are what they are. They're really great run stoppers, pretty decent pass rushers, but JTT hasn't and probably won't live up to his, rating that he had coming out of high school. I say that, and now he'll probably go and have like a 2022 Penn State game performance where he just absolutely takes over the game against Oregon. And if I say that, I'll eat my crow and drink my Captain and Coke, which this definitely isn't, by the way. Definitely not Captain and Coke. It's just Coke, Mark. It's definitely not an alcoholic beverage. I'm not drinking on the job. The FCC doesn't regulate this stuff, though. I'm okay, right? I don't know. Anyway, we might have some more chats coming in. If no one else wants to comment, Troy V says those details don't tell the entire picture. Most offensive plays against them. QB got the ball out in about 2 seconds. Offenses were playing the short game against Ohio State. Yeah, there's a little bit of that, but also it's Akron. Like, say what you want about Michigan, but Josiah Stewart was able to still get some sacks on a USC team that was trying to get the ball out quick. Eventually there were multiple points in that game, and in every game Ohio State has had so far this season where they put teams in 3rd and longs, which are opportune times for a sack, and they didn't get it done. Now, that's my one critique of Jack Sawyer and JTT. They are great players. Don't get me wrong. Even I, as a Michigan fan, will sit here and say they're great. But JTT, there's a little bit of a Rashawn Gary aspect to his, story at Ohio State. Anyone who remembers Rashawn Gary at Michigan, he was a very, very, I think he was the top recruit in his class. I remember it was a huge deal when he committed to Michigan. Everyone thought he was going to be a premier pass rusher, and he just never turned into that. He never did at Michigan. He's a great player in the NFL now, but a lot like Nico Collins, Michigan didn't use him correctly.